Well, now, I was thinking earlier today about a sandwich. Not a particularly remarkable sandwich. Not one of those towering deli contraptions with 17 meats and a structural engineering permit. Just a sandwich, bread, something between the bread, possibly mustard if the situation calls for it. And that got me wondering about bread, because bread is an interesting thing when you stop to consider it, which most people don't. They just eat it. But if you really think about bread, really think about it, you realize bread is essentially a very successful form of cooked foam. That's what it is. You whip air into flour paste, wait around while invisible organisms burp carbon dioxide into it, and then you bake the whole situation until the bubbles freeze in place. And people say chemistry is boring. Now, if you take bread and put something inside it, suddenly you've invented lunch. Humanity has been very proud of that accomplishment for centuries. Every culture on Earth independently discovered that putting food between two things that are also food is a very efficient system. Romans had it, the English had it, Americans perfected it by making the sandwich approximately the size of a small sofa. But here's the thing about sandwiches. Nobody really knows where the idea of a sandwich begins and ends. If you put filling between bread, it's a sandwich. Fair enough. But what if the bread is round? Is a hamburger a sandwich? Philosophers have fought over smaller questions than that. What about tacos? Now you're in dangerous territory, because a taco is technically bread holding other food. But it's also folded, which introduces geometry into the problem. The moment geometry gets involved in lunch, civilization starts to wobble a little. And that's when I realized something. Food is basically architecture. You build structures out of ingredients. A sandwich is a two-story building with edible insulation. A burger is a compressed edible apartment complex. Lasagna is a parking garage made of pasta. Nobody wants to admit this, but if an engineer looked at a club sandwich long enough, he would probably start calculating load-bearing mayonnaise. Now, mayonnaise itself is another mystery, because mayonnaise is basically oil and eggs that have been convinced, against all natural instincts, to behave like a polite, creamy paste. That's emulsification, which is a fancy word for things that should not cooperate somehow decided to cooperate, sort of like most committee meetings. And if you think about it long enough, mayonnaise is really just a negotiation between physics and stubbornness. Egg says, I can hold these oil droplets together. Oil says, I do not wish to be held. Egg says, too bad. That's how mayonnaise happens. But back to the sandwich. Because once you start thinking about sandwiches, your brain begins wandering into other territories. For instance, the cutting of the sandwich. Some people cut sandwiches diagonally. Some people cut them straight across. And the diagonal people believe, very firmly, that the diagonal cut improves the sandwich experience. Now, scientifically speaking, that is nonsense. But emotionally speaking, they're completely correct. Because the diagonal cut creates triangles, and triangles feel more exciting than rectangles. Triangles are adventurous shapes. Rectangles are shapes that attend accounting conferences. Triangles climb mountains. Rectangles file paperwork. This is why pizza slices are triangular. Nobody would get excited about rectangular pizza slices unless they were extremely hungry or trapped in Nebraska. And so there I was thinking about sandwiches, which led me to triangles, which led me to geometry, which somehow led me to thinking about pigeons. Now, pigeons are fascinating creatures. They walk like tiny businessmen who forgot something in the office. Very determined, very serious, always moving with the sense that an important pigeon meeting is about to begin somewhere near a statue. And pigeons have this peculiar habit of nodding while they walk. Scientists say it helps stabilize their vision, but I prefer to believe pigeons are constantly agreeing with themselves. Yes, absolutely. Quite right, Gerald. You never see a pigeon looking uncertain. That's a level of confidence most people would like to achieve. Imagine walking into a meeting with pigeon confidence. Boss says, "Did you finish the report?" You nod slowly. Yes, quite right. Excellent report. There is no report. But the nodding gives you authority. Now, speaking of authority, that reminds me of ducks. Because ducks are the opposite of pigeons. Ducks look like they just remembered they left the stove on. They waddle, which is not a dignified motion, but it is extremely honest. A duck does not pretend to be graceful. A duck understands that gravity is winning most of the time, and that's admirable. You never see ducks trying to look impressive. Peacocks do that. Peacocks are birds that decided fashion was more important than aerodynamics. Peacocks can barely fly, but they look fantastic while not flying, which is essentially the bird version of wearing high heels. Now, when you combine pigeons, ducks, and sandwiches, you start noticing something about the world. Most things exist for no clear reason. Take rubber ducks. Why do rubber ducks exist? They float in bathtubs. They squeak. That is the entire job description. And yet, humanity produces millions of them. There are probably more rubber ducks on Earth than there are real ducks. If aliens arrive and search our planet, they're going to assume the rubber duck is our dominant species, which honestly might not be the worst misunderstanding. Rubber ducks are peaceful. They don't argue about politics. They don't honk at traffic lights. They just float and squeak when squeezed. Imagine if humans worked that way. Instead of arguing, people would just squeak politely. Excuse me, I disagree. Squeak. That would simplify a lot of meetings. Now, meetings themselves are another strange invention. A meeting is when several people gather in a room to discuss things that could have been solved by 2 sentences and a sandwich. But instead, we add chairs and coffee, and occasionally a projector that nobody understands. The projector is important because it allows someone to display charts that prove something nobody asked about. Charts have tremendous authority. If you draw a line on a graph, people will believe nearly anything. Even if the graph is titled, Projected Happiness Based on Sandwich Geometry, someone will nod thoughtfully, probably a pigeon. And that brings me back to geometry again, because the shape of things matters more than people realize. Take hats. A hat is simply a shape that rests on your head, but the shape completely changes how people perceive you. A cowboy hat says, I own boots and possibly livestock. A top hat says, I either perform magic or own a railroad. A baseball cap says, I have opinions about hot dogs. And then there are those tiny little hats some people wear at fancy events. Those aren't hats. Those are decorative suggestions. A hat should be capable of holding soup in an emergency. That's my rule. Because historically speaking, hats had jobs. Farmers wore hats to keep the sun out. Soldiers wore helmets to stop unpleasant surprises. Explorers wore hats to look heroic while getting lost. But nowadays, hats mostly exist so people can say, that hat is interesting, which is the polite way of saying, I am confused but supportive. And confusion is an important part of life. Without confusion, we wouldn't have philosophy. Philosophy is what happens when intelligent people stare at the universe and say, hold on a minute, Socrates did that. Descartes did that. Probably a lot of people did that, but most of them were busy making sandwiches. Now, Socrates, if I remember correctly, walked around asking people questions until they became extremely uncomfortable, which is a wonderful strategy if you enjoy awkward silence. You ask a man, what is justice? He says, I don't know. You say, exactly. And suddenly, you're a philosopher. I tried this once in a grocery store. I asked a man in the cereal aisle, what is breakfast? He said, sir, please move your cart. Philosophy has its limits. Now, where was I? Ah, yes, cereal. Cereal is another one of those things humanity just accepted without much investigation. Someone somewhere decided that what the morning truly needed was tiny crunchy shapes floating in milk, and we all went along with it. But if you stop and think about cereal long enough, the whole situation gets suspicious. Because cereal is essentially dessert pretending to be responsible. You pour it into a bowl, you add milk. Suddenly, everyone nods and says, ah yes, a nutritious breakfast. But if you pour chocolate syrup on ice cream, people start asking questions. It's the milk that gives cereal credibility. Milk is the most trustworthy liquid in society. If milk endorses something, people assume it must be wholesome. Put milk next to cookies? Wholesome. Milk with cake? Comforting. Milk and coffee? Now you're an adult. Milk has public relations power. Meanwhile, orange juice just sits there looking nervous. Orange juice is trying very hard to appear respectable, but everyone secretly knows it's just fruit pretending to be a beverage. Fruit is not naturally a drink. Fruit is a snack that got squeezed too hard. And that squeezing process is fascinating. Somewhere in human history, someone looked at an orange and said, I bet there's liquid in there. And they were right. That was a very bold guess. Imagine the moment of discovery. One caveman squeezing fruit over a rock. Another caveman watching closely. Suddenly juice comes out. They both stare at it. One of them says, well, I'll be... And civilization moves forward. Most discoveries probably happen that way. Someone guessed something ridiculous. Then it worked. Take the invention of the wheel. One fellow rolls a round rock down a hill. Another fellow sees it and says, that looks useful. Now we have shopping carts, which are not nearly as helpful as people hoped. Shopping carts have one wheel that refuses to cooperate. Every cart has it. It doesn't matter which store you visit. There will always be one wheel that makes a sound like a cricket learning the harmonica. Squeak, squeak, squeak. The cart veers left. You try to correct it. The cart disagrees. Now you're wrestling a metal basket through the produce section, like a cowboy trying to steer a stubborn mule. Meanwhile, someone nearby is calmly selecting avocados like a professional fruit judge. Avocados are another mystery, because nobody actually knows when an avocado is ready. People pretend they do. They squeeze it thoughtfully. They nod. But secretly, everyone is guessing. An avocado has exactly 3 states of existence: hard as a brick, perfect for 5 minutes, brown disappointment. And that middle stage is extremely brief. You blink, and suddenly the avocado has become something that looks like it lost a boxing match. Now, tomatoes have a similar problem. But tomatoes are more confident about it. Tomatoes will sit on the counter looking cheerful for several days. Then one morning you wake up and they've collapsed into philosophical despair. Produce is very dramatic. Bananas are the most dramatic of all. Bananas age like actors in silent movies. They start bright and optimistic. Then they slowly develop spots. Then more spots. Eventually, they look like they've been through a small war. At that point, people say, "Oh, we should make banana bread." Banana bread is the retirement plan for bananas. When bananas realize their glamorous yellow career is over, they move quietly into baked goods, which is a dignified ending if you ask me. But the banana itself is a fascinating object. For one thing, it comes with its own wrapper. That's efficient packaging. Nature looked at the banana and said, "This one needs a jacket." Apples don't get jackets. Oranges do, but theirs require tools. Bananas just unzip. It's the fruit equivalent of wearing a tracksuit. Now, the shape of a banana raises interesting questions. Because bananas are curved, and humans have spent thousands of years trying to make straight things. Straight roads, straight buildings, straight lines. But bananas look at all that effort and say, "No thank you." Bananas are naturally curved, which means if you ever see a straight banana, something suspicious has happened. Probably a laboratory. Laboratories are where straight bananas would come from. Laboratories are wonderful places. They contain people who ask questions that begin with, "What would happen if—" That is a dangerous sentence, because it leads to things like fluorescent mice, and exploding soda bottles, and robots that vacuum the floor. Robot vacuums are another interesting invention. For thousands of years, humans pushed brooms around their homes. Then someone said, "What if the broom just wandered around by itself?" And now we have little round machines bumping into furniture like confused turtles. They roam the house. They make decisions. Sometimes they trap themselves under a chair and begin contemplating their existence. If robot vacuums could talk, they would probably say things like, "I was created to clean, yet I cannot escape this table leg." Very philosophical machines. Of course, philosophy is unavoidable when you're trapped under furniture. Even humans do that sometimes. You crawl under a desk to plug something in. You bump your head. You drop the screwdriver. Now you're lying on the floor staring at dust bunnies and wondering how life led you here. Dust bunnies are remarkable creatures. Not technically creatures, but they behave like small animals. They gather in corners. They multiply mysteriously. You remove them one day, and the next day they've returned like tiny gray nomads. Nobody knows how dust bunnies reproduce. Science has theories, but none of them are very convincing. Personally, I think dust bunnies are just shy clouds, little pieces of atmosphere that decided to settle down behind the sofa. And speaking of sofas, sofas have a fascinating relationship with lost objects. Anything dropped into a sofa enters another dimension. Remote controls vanish there. Coins vanish there. Sometimes entire snacks vanish there. You reach between the cushions and discover archaeological layers. A penny from last Tuesday. A cracker from last month. Possibly a sock that hasn't been seen since 2017. It's like excavating Pompeii, except the ruins are made of upholstery. And archaeologists, when you think about it, are basically professional couch investigators. They dig through layers of dirt looking for things people forgot. That's history. History is just organized forgetfulness. We forget things. Later, someone digs them up and writes a book. If archaeologists excavated modern living rooms, future historians would assume our civilization worshipped television remotes. Because those things appear everywhere. Under chairs, behind cabinets, inside couch cushions. Remotes multiply like rabbits. You buy one television and suddenly there are 6 remotes. One for the TV, one for the streaming box, one for the sound system, one mysterious remote nobody recognizes but nobody dares throw away. Because the moment you throw it away, something will stop working. That is the rule of electronics. Throw nothing away, especially cables. Cables are sacred artifacts. Every household contains a box of cables nobody understands. USB cables, charging cables, cables that probably belong to devices that went extinct in 2009. But you keep them anyway, because someday a situation will arise where you need exactly that cable. And on that day, you will open the box and discover that none of the cables are the correct one, which is the second rule of electronics. The correct cable exists, but it is always somewhere else, probably in a drawer you already checked. Twice. Now, speaking of drawers, every house has at least one drawer that has given up on being organized. You know, the one You open it and immediately see rubber bands, batteries, paper clips, 3 pens that don't work, 2 keys that open nothing, and a screwdriver that somehow migrated there without explanation. That drawer has a name. It's called the junk drawer, but that's unfair because nothing inside it believes it is junk. Every object in that drawer once had a purpose. That screwdriver once tightened something important. Those batteries once powered a toy that played music loudly at 6 in the morning. That key once unlocked something that probably shouldn't have been locked in the first place. But over time, they all drifted into the drawer like retirees moving to Florida. And once something enters the junk drawer, it begins a second life. You might not use it for years, but the moment you need something strange, say a rubber band and a mysterious screw, the junk drawer suddenly becomes the most important place in the house. That's because humans are excellent at saving things just in case. We save jars. We save boxes. We save cables that we believe might someday connect something to something else. And that habit probably goes all the way back to the first human who said, "We should keep this rock," not because the rock was special, but because it might become useful later. Now, rocks themselves are remarkable things. They sit around for thousands of years doing absolutely nothing, yet somehow they become very important. Geologists spend their entire careers looking at rocks and saying things like, "This one is approximately 300 million years old." That's impressive. Imagine being a rock that old. You've seen continents drift. Dinosaurs appear. Dinosaurs disappear. Meanwhile, you're just sitting there thinking, well, that was interesting. Rocks are patient. Much more patient than people. People get impatient in elevators. Elevators are fascinating machines because they combine 2 things humans distrust: heights and cables. You step into a metal box. The doors close. And suddenly, you are being lifted hundreds of feet by a rope somewhere inside the building. And everyone pretends this is perfectly normal. But watch people in elevators closely. They behave strangely. Nobody talks. Everyone stares at the numbers above the door like they're watching a suspense film. 3, 4, 5. Sometimes someone coughs politely. Someone else checks their phone. Nobody acknowledges the fact that 6 strangers are currently being hoisted vertically inside a building. Now, if elevators didn't exist, buildings would look very different. Skyscrapers would be extremely unpopular. People would say, 40 floors, I'll stay home. The invention of the elevator is the only reason cities grew upward instead of outward. Before elevators, tall buildings were basically towers for people with very strong legs. Which reminds me of stairs. Stairs are honest architecture. You see stairs and immediately understand the situation. Ah, yes, I must climb. There is no mystery. Stairs do not pretend to be effortless. They tell you the truth. Elevators say, relax. Stairs say, you'll earn it. And honestly, stairs have a point. Most things worth doing involve climbing something. Climbing a mountain, climbing a ladder, climbing out of bed on Monday morning. Now, ladders are another interesting invention, because a ladder is basically a portable staircase that decided to travel. Ladders lean against things. They trust walls. That's a very optimistic design philosophy. Imagine inventing the ladder for the first time. Someone probably said, I have an idea. Let's make a long stick with smaller sticks across it. Another person asked, what will it do? It will help us go upward. And it won't fall? Well, let's find out. That's the spirit of invention. Most human progress began with someone saying, this might work. Then everyone stepped back slightly, which brings me to clouds. Clouds are the most relaxed things in the sky. They drift. They change shape. They look like animals, ships, castles, or sometimes mashed potatoes. Children lie in the grass and watch clouds for hours. Adults rarely do that anymore. Adults say, I have responsibilities, but the clouds keep drifting anyway. They don't mind. Clouds are patient observers of human activity. They've watched empires rise and fall. They've watched people invent umbrellas. Umbrellas are fascinating because they are portable roofs. Tiny personal roofs. You open one and suddenly you're walking around inside your own little house for rain. Of course, umbrellas also have a habit of turning inside out during windstorms, at which point they become modern art. Which reminds me of socks. Socks are the most mysterious items in the laundry. Because socks disappear. Everyone knows this. You put 2 socks in the washing machine. One comes back. The other has vanished into the fabric dimension. No one understands how this happens. Some people blame the dryer. Others suspect the washing machine. Personally, I think socks are explorers. One sock eventually decides, I wonder what's beyond this drum. And off it goes. Perhaps somewhere there exists a secret world filled entirely with adventurous socks. A place where they gather and tell stories. I escaped during the spin cycle. Impressive. Of course, humans also enjoy telling stories. That's one of the oldest traditions we have. People gather around fires. or radios, or screens. And someone begins with the phrase, "Let me tell you something." Now, the funny thing about stories is that they usually try to mean something. They teach lessons. They explain life. They tie everything together neatly at the end. But every now and then you hear a story that doesn't really explain anything. It just wanders, like a walk through town where you stop and notice things. A pigeon, a sandwich shop, a man arguing with a shopping cart. Little observations that don't solve the mysteries of the universe, but make the journey interesting. And maybe that's the point, because if you think about it long enough, really long enough, life itself is a bit like that. People are born. They wander around noticing things. They invent sandwiches. They argue about geometry. They put milk in cereal. And eventually, they sit somewhere comfortable and say, that was interesting, which is probably the most honest summary anyone could give. Not a grand explanation, not a perfect conclusion, just a quiet observation. The world is full of strange little details: bananas with jackets, dust bunnies in corners, elevators carrying silent passengers. And somewhere out there, a pigeon is still walking across a sidewalk, nodding thoughtfully, completely certain that whatever it's doing makes perfect sense. Which, when you think about it, might be the best approach of all. Just keep walking, keep nodding, and if someone asks what you're doing, you can always say, "I'm explaining something very important." Even if it's mostly about sandwiches and pigeons, and absolutely nothing at all. Pigeons are interesting birds, mostly because they walk around cities like they own the place. They strut across sidewalks with the confidence of a man who has just purchased a railroad, head bobbing, chest out, looking around as if they are inspecting property values. And in a way, they probably do think they own the place. Cities, after all, are full of statues, ledges, bridges, rooftops, thousands of comfortable little perches designed by humans, but immediately claimed by pigeons. We build architecture. Pigeons say, "Ah, yes, excellent pigeon furniture." Now, pigeons have another quality that cities are very familiar with. Pigeons are extremely generous. They give back to the environment constantly, mostly from above. And what they give back is, pigeon poop. Now, pigeon poop has a long and complicated relationship with civilization, because people pretend to be surprised by it. Someone walks under a bridge, sees a splatter on the sidewalk, and says, "Well, that's unpleasant." But birds have been doing this long before sidewalks existed. Dinosaurs were probably doing it. You think a Tyrannosaurus worried about where it left things? Not a chance. Nature has always had a very simple philosophy about waste. Gravity handles it. Early humans eventually realized gravity alone was not a sufficient sanitation strategy. Because when people began living together in cities, something interesting happened. Everything started to accumulate. And when enough accumulation occurs, someone eventually says, "We need a system." That is how sewers were born. Now, some of the earliest sewer systems go back thousands of years. The ancient cities of the Indus Valley Civilization, for instance, places like Mohenjo-Daro, had organized drainage systems around 2600 BC. That's remarkable. 4,000 years ago, people were already saying, "Let's move unpleasant things away from the living room." The Romans, of course, took this very seriously. Romans loved engineering. They built roads. They built aqueducts. They built baths. And they built one of the most famous sewer systems in history, the Cloaca Maxima, which is a wonderful name. It sounds like a Roman general. Behold, Cloaca Maxima marches upon the city. But the Cloaca Maxima was actually a giant drainage system carrying waste out of Rome and into the Tiber River, which worked fairly well, though the fish probably had opinions about it. Romans understood something important. Water is extremely helpful when dealing with unpleasant things. If you add enough water and gravity, you can convince almost anything to go somewhere else. And humans have been using that strategy ever since. But not every civilization had the luxury of Roman plumbing. In medieval cities, things were less organized. People would empty chamber pots out windows, which meant walking down the street required a certain amount of situational awareness. If you heard someone shout a warning from above, you stepped aside quickly. History books rarely mention that part of daily life. But it happened. Eventually, as cities grew larger, people realized they needed more reliable sanitation. Because if you don't manage waste properly, diseases begin to appear, and nothing motivates engineers quite like the threat of disease. So in the 1800s, cities like London began building modern sewer systems, huge underground tunnels carrying wastewater away from neighborhoods, miles and miles of pipes, an entire hidden infrastructure beneath the streets, which is fascinating when you think about it. We walk through cities admiring buildings and parks and monuments, but beneath our feet is an enormous unseen machine, quietly transporting things nobody wants to discuss during dinner. Modern sewer systems are marvels of engineering. Pumps, treatment plants, filtration systems, chemistry, biology. Thousands of workers maintaining it all, so the rest of society can comfortably pretend the problem has been solved forever. But even today, the system is still basically the same idea humanity discovered thousands of years ago. Add water, add pipes, send it somewhere else. Of course, birds never bothered with any of that. Birds remain committed to the original gravity-based model. A pigeon sitting on a statue has exactly one sanitation strategy, which is why statues often look like they've been participating in a snowstorm made entirely of chalk. City planners have tried many solutions: spikes on ledges, fake owls, ultrasonic devices, reflective tape, entire committees devoted to discouraging pigeons from holding conferences on monuments. But pigeons remain unimpressed. They simply relocate to another ledge and continue their business. In a way, pigeons are very traditional creatures. They still follow the ancient natural system, while humans have built miles of pipes and tunnels to accomplish roughly the same end result, which just goes to show that civilization is mostly about managing the consequences of living together. Food, shelter, transportation, waste. We solve problems with engineering. Birds solve problems with gravity. And somehow the whole system keeps working, which is honestly quite remarkable when you stop and think about it. Because every city on Earth is basically a giant, complicated machine designed to allow millions of people to eat sandwiches without the streets becoming, well, unmanageable. And yet, every once in a while, you walk under a bridge, a pigeon looks down thoughtfully, and you are reminded that nature still has a vote in the matter. Which brings us back to pigeons again, strutting across the sidewalk, nodding confidently, entirely unconcerned with sewer infrastructure, and probably wondering why humans make everything so complicated.